The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final ARC Payments Forum session. This time it's actually ARC who's going to talk. And Kevin and I are here to do an update on the ARC payments and kind of what we've heard over the last week as the payment forum has taken place. And we've heard from the card brands and we had a panel. And so we're going to try to summarize what we heard and give you a little bit of update about what's happening at ARC. So here are your hosts, and today's presenters are me, Jennifer Watkins, Director of Payments, and Kevin Haig, he's the Manager of Payment Processing and Acceptance. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. We're going to be going back and forth, but I'm going to hand it over to Kevin.
Great, Jennifer. Hey, thank you. So as with the other sessions, we're just going to go through a little housekeeping. Antitrust statement, just please keep in mind that we do have competitors on the call. And as such, we should refrain from sharing anything along pricing, product, new market strategies, really anything that's not public shouldn't be shared in this forum. So please keep that in mind. All attendees are muted upon entrance. And if you have questions, we'll take them throughout the session. So please feel free to enter them into the question box. And like I said, we'll go ahead and answer those as we move. This session will be recorded, and the deck and information will be shared with all those who are registered. For an agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about the background and goals. I'll share a little bit on payment trends and data quality tied to interchange, update the group here on our 3D secure efforts, and Jennifer will handle the chargebacks, the card brand update, and looking forward. Just real quick, I think just from those who've been on prior sessions, those that are in attendance, we have the airlines, agencies. This is our third year with the agencies participating, and so we're seeing some good growth. And of course, we have to have the acquirers and processors, the system providers, the GDSs, the card brands, and third parties. So those are all who are listening in. With that, I'll jump it back to Jennifer.
Yeah, so like Kevin was saying, this is, I think it's the 5th or 6th year of the ARC Payments Forum. And just by way of background, people who've been to all 5 have heard me talk about this every year, which is one of the challenges that we were having several years ago is that the card brands, one of the card brands made some rules changes. And what was happening is that the data that was required to settle that transaction successfully wasn't being passed through the process. So from the GDS, well, actually point of sale agency, GDS, ARC, we output the transactions to acquirers, they output them to the card brands. In that flow, the data that's required to settle a transaction wasn't there. And it was just because there wasn't a lot of communication in that process. And so there was a need for us to collaborate, get in line, make sure we all had understanding of what was required so that we could be successful. So the goal is to bring all the participants in the transaction flow together to ensure that we're supporting payment processing in a way that provides the best customer experience, improves risk management, reduces fraud, prevents loss, and ensures the lowest cost processing of payments. It's about listening to everyone who's in the room. Typically, we would be in the room. We hope that we will be in a room next year. Understanding what the challenges are at the point of sale. What are the challenges that the GDS have? And the card brands have been great at listening to us and sort of we as a group advocating with them on behalf of the industry. And ultimately driving solutions, which we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the things we have, as a group have done as far as driving solutions for the industry. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin now to talk about ARC.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So we're just going to run through a few slides, a little bit about the landscape of ARC. So this is at the end of 2020. Just give you an idea of sort of where we're sitting with airlines and agencies. So we had about 235 airlines, a little over 11,000 agency transactions. And in 2020, we all know it was a challenge. We ended up processing about 23 billion in settled transactions. And cash to credit, we always just sort of share this amount, 92% cash or credit and 8% cash. So from an agency location perspective, I think just gives you a little history as to where agencies have been. You can see that there continues to be consolidation with the agency locations. And I think we'll continue to see that on into 2021 as everybody adjusts to what's happening after COVID. And with that, I'm going to jump to some ARC payment trends. Again, just sort of showing the history. The good old days, I guess, 2018, 2019, we were seeing steady growth before COVID. 97.4 billion is what we processed last year. And then, of course, with COVID, you end up seeing the dip. And when we look at cash and credit through the end of 2020, normally you can see the trend that we saw about 80 or 90-10 with cash and credit, but 2020 was a different year. And I know there's probably a number of reasons that we're seeing cash around 8% versus the normal 10%. But if we leap forward, what we're seeing on the screen here is through May of 2021, we're seeing cash climbing back up to the 13% range, which is higher than what we've seen it in the past. And we think a lot of that is being driven by the leisure's leading. And so you have the OTAs out there doing packages and ending up paying ARC in cash and credit cards. So I think that's what tends to drive that a little bit. Looking at card brand by dollar volume, again, here you can take a look at the MasterCard, the Visas, the Discovers, those leisure brands. Those are the ones that we're seeing the increase. And the corporate cards, the American Express and the UATP, you're seeing a little bit of a downturn. So as corporate travel comes back, we'll hopefully see those brands end up picking up where they sort of left off and seeing a little bit more leveling out of percentages that we're seeing among the cards. When looking at average gross ticket, again, you can see 2018, 2019, a little bit of increases. Business was growing. And then when the pandemic hit, the average ticket in 2020 dropped a little bit, and a little further in 2021. I think that reflects the airlines out there trying to have appealing pricing and trying to drive volume back from a pricing perspective to keep things moving forward. This is a slide we've shared in the past, but looking at distribution of refunds and exchanges, I think this tells a sort of a nice story. The green line is the transaction activity, so transaction counts, and you can see really January 20, volumes are up 4 million volumes, and then as we see COVID coming across, of course, that steep drop as COVID hit and everybody stopped traveling. And then if you look throughout, you can start to see the nice trending transactions improving. You get a little dip around the new year, but then here in 2021, you can start to see a little steeper incline, which I think is really good news as recovery is, I think, well on its way. The blue and orange are refunds and exchanges. And when you look at the April-May timeframe, of course, in the middle of COVID, I think we can all go back and remember that experience. We saw a lot of refunds, a lot of exchanges taking place, more so in the refund level back in the mid-April and May timeframe. And then as we come out of COVID, we start to see the exchanges taking over a little bit and into the earlier part of this year. And that really reflects, I think, a lot of the travel vouchers that have been out there and consumers going ahead and exchanging those travel vouchers and using them. So I'll stop briefly just to see if there's any questions on that data.
We have Judy from Beyond who's going to ask questions, but I'll just jump in because I'm looking at them right now. We don't have any questions so far, but we know it's hard. It takes time for people to type in questions, so they may come up later, but none at the moment. Okay,
we'll move on. So we'll take a look at some of ARC's data integrity efforts. And if you've attended prior forums, this slide is nothing new. But ARC has done a lot of work with data integrity, and it was one of the key, and still remains one of the key focuses for myself here working with the GDSs, the brands, and the acquirers. So to Jennifer's point, I think she sort of talked about how the payments form started, about data not being correct and sort of being a surprise from one of the brands, and so pulling everybody together and identifying it and bringing solutions about. We looked at data integrity, and these are the key items that we monitor from an interchange perspective. So in order to make sure that transactions are qualifying at the best rates, these are the data elements that we're looking at and monitoring on a regular basis. And as you can see, when we first started out back in January of 2016, there were data elements out there that were missing a fair amount of the time, sometimes up to 60% depending on the GDS. And really what that impact is when those data elements are missing, you're not going to be getting the authorization data passing through to the acquirers, and we'll start to see some downgrades. So when those downgrades occur, you're going to see an increase in expense. And so that's something that we identified, and it's okay, how can we work together as an industry and with the participants and improve that data? So we started monitoring some of these elements. Also, when the data is missing or not there, you run into compliance fees. I think you've heard some of the brands in previous presentations talk a little bit about data quality, and compliance fees are one of the additional costs that get hit, the airlines get hit with when the data elements aren't there. And they don't pass some of the data edits, and you'll start to see compliance fees. And so those are things that we end up working with the GDSs and identifying those items and working through and correcting those items and finding solutions. And then also, along with the data quality, is if certain data elements aren't there, you have authorization-related chargebacks. So by making sure that the auth code is valid, that we're passing certain auth data elements, we help reduce those chargebacks related to authorization codes and things. So by looking at these key elements and monitoring them, we're really working with the industry and the airlines and the GDSs and acquirers to make sure, as one of our goals state, to have a cost-effective acceptance for cards. And so, as you can see, we've worked over time. We're doing pretty well. When we started out with the GDSs, we sort of threw a target out there of 3% or less, getting them aligned, and only missing around those ranges. And by the end of May 2018, you can see we're pretty consistent. We've worked hard with the GDSs, and we've been able to keep those data elements only missing about 3% of the time. So if we bump forward a year, sort of picked up in May of 2019, you can see that we're still doing quite well. We're still within those targets. But then you can see certain spikes. The spike in May of 2020, we had a OTA that was working with a GDS, and they made some changes, and the data went missing. And so we saw a spike in this particular visa authorization response code. So we reached out to the GDS, who then looked at it and reached out to the acquirer and did some work, and you can see we brought it back in line. So in that window, there was risk of downgrades occurring to some degree from a missing visa authorization response. And then back in October, November of 2020, again, we saw a little bit, a GDS had some challenges with some changes they made, and some of the data went missing. We identified it, reached out to the GDS, and we went ahead and did some work with them to correct those things. So I think one of the key is, again, by monitoring this data, working with the GDSs, we can go ahead and try to address downgrades and keep integrity fees and chargeback issues to a minimum. So there's some challenges still. We continue to meet with the GDSs on a regular basis, on a bi-monthly basis. We share what we call peer reviews with them. So this will show how a particular GDS is doing against the peer group. And it's sort of a good thing. I mean, some of the GDSs out there understand where they are with their peers, and some have opportunities to improve a little further along with their data and enhance it, and we're working with those GDSs. But we always get positive feedback from the GDSs on how this data quality helps them, at least internally, to sort of benchmark their efforts and what we're doing to help improve data quality overall. We're also work with the acquirers, and the acquirers at times have certain tools that they use that they can go ahead and use additional data or reporting to help supplement authorization data when it's missing. But if those reports are late or those reports go missing, you'll see an uptick in downgrades. And that then becomes a challenge again for the industry. So I think we continue to work with the brands and identify the better solution is to get that data up front, get it through on the transaction, and making sure we're passing that information along. I know right now that we've got a lot of the noise out of the system, I call it noise because before, if you remember, we wanted to make sure that the GDSs were passing the data, making sure that the data that they had was good. And now that we have the noise out there and we're down around 3%, we're taking a look at some of, sort of what the next level of data is. And what we're finding out is that when data goes missing or when we are up around the 2 to 3%, it's usually agency behavior. They're ticketing outside of, or they're doing the authorization outside of ticketing. And so our best practices just mention and say, hey, agents, you should do authorization at the time of ticketing. That way we can ensure that we're getting the authorization data passed through, and again, we can make sure that those transactions are qualifying for the best rates. We're seeing some examples of agencies obtaining an authorization for a transaction, and then they may cancel it and rebook that ticket. But instead of going out for a new authorization, they'll use a previous authorization. And then when that transaction gets to the acquirer or the issuer, it's rejected because that authorization doesn't match what the transaction said. So there's always opportunities to work better with the GDSs and agencies and to go ahead and improve quality. We know we're not going to get to 100% because it's just a challenge with some of the handoffs and the way the GDSs and the way the agencies do their business processes. But, that's sort of what we continue to work on with them. And we also are starting to work with acquirers on the next level. There's a couple of acquirers that were out there that now that business has slowed, and we've seen this a little bit well on the agency side, is I think some of the anomalies are showing up, where some of the behaviors are showing up a little larger, to say. They're working and showing different data elements, different challenges. So we're digging down. We're seeing, invalid auth codes. We're seeing examples of maybe some itinerary data that are some other elements necessary to qualify for the best interchange. But we're seeing, I guess, some of the things that were hidden before with the larger volumes. And so, as I mentioned, we're working with about 2 or 3 acquirers on improving and enhancing that data a little further. So when business does return, we're in a position to make sure that the activity and the volume is improving and we're qualifying at the best rates. There's a little background on integrity. Jennifer, anything?
That's great.
You want to add?
I appreciate, that's a great summary, Kevin. Thank you. I'm just looking at the MC tick. Can you talk a little bit about that one? That's just the yellow line in the upper right-hand corner there. Can you give us a little background and sort of what's happening on that?
Sure. I know some of the GDSs out there appreciate this, but the MasterCard tick was a newer data element to some degree. I mean, MasterCard has been talking about this now for about 3 or 4 years, and they delayed the implementation. And so the tick is really another security data element to help with the transaction and the qualification level of the transaction, and something that MasterCard's added. We've been working with the GDSs for quite some time on getting that information out there and getting passed to ARC. And as is indicated by the graph, we have a GDS that is out there passing today. And the other ones, I think, either have the work done or in queue, but I think they're waiting to hear back from MasterCard as to when that's actually going to be implemented. And so that's just an example of one of the items that we worked with on MasterCard, and they added it as a new data element a while ago. We had to go ahead and update our files for both the file inbound from the GDS and our file outbound to the acquirers. And so now that's a data element that we'll be monitoring. And once MasterCard tells us when that tick is going to be effective or implemented across the board, and hopefully we'll start to see this value drop more in line with what we're seeing the other data elements in place.
Yeah, I think that one's, we've been watching that one for years, because I think we identified, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years ago that this field was going to impact interchange qualification. And what that, I think we estimated it was going to be either between 80 and 100 basis points difference if the data was missing. So it would downgrade to those who are in the details to a standard rate if it was missing. Fortunately, MasterCard has pushed it off and pushed it off. And yeah, Kevin, to your point, we've got a couple of the GDSs queued up to implement it when the time comes, so that we don't find ourselves in a position where we have transactions downgrading and costing the airlines, 100 basis points per transaction. So that when MasterCard comes out and says, okay, guys, like the edits coming in and you need to be prepared, I think those GDSs will be ready. Yeah.
Yep. So good.
Cool. Transaction integrity class. Yeah. We call it the TIC, transaction integrity.
Yes.
Yeah.
There we go. But not sure if there's any particular questions on this before we go forward.
I don't think that there are. I mean, I guess just for those airlines out there that are listening, I don't know, some airlines monitor interchange qualification really closely, and some don't until until the CEO or someone's going, what is this big expense on my that's hitting us every day? And just for those who, whether you're watching it or not, just know that ARC is watching, and that we are really focused on making sure that the data that we need to qualify those transactions for the best rates is coming in and being passed. And the GDSs have been actually fantastic partners in that, because they've got the heavy lift. They're the ones that have to get the data in and pass it. Sometimes it's a heavy lift on ARC too, because we have to make changes to our output. It's a heavy lift on acquirers, but the GDSs have been great partners in that.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great point, Jennifer, because it's sort of that ARC role is that we are facilitators, but really when it comes down to it, there's not much that we can do. The information is coming in from the point of sale, so it's really those GDSs that have to make those changes in order to pass to it. And then on the outbound side, I mean, we can do the work, and the GDSs can do the work, but if the acquirer changes and addressing it, then of course you're still going to see the downgrades from the brand. So we're not working in a vacuum. It's definitely a partnership throughout the payment chain. And so we really do appreciate that cooperation and effort from all our partners in making this happen. So I'd like to take full credit, but I can't, unfortunately. So.
Well, we call it herding cats sometimes. That's how it can be. But everyone's been a great partner, yeah.
So good. If there's nothing specific on data integrity, I'll go ahead and move on.
I don't see any questions.
Yep. So I'll go ahead and move on to 3D Secure. So 3D Secure update, I think if you all know, 3D Secure has been out there for some time. And I think I'll just sort of step back. We hear it, we throw it around, but I think really what is 3D Secure? And from our perspective, or I think from anybody's perspective, it's just another tool in a merchant's risk management strategy to help reduce chargebacks. And the goal really is to make sure that we're transactions that qualify, that we're passing through the additional data elements from the authentication provider through the GDS to ARC, and then onto the acquirers and on into the payment system to make sure, and this is the key, this is the whole thing we looked at, is to make sure the liability shift takes place. So that liability shift moves from the merchant in the transaction, which in our case is the airline, and moves to the issuer. I mean, that was the key, that was our key goal, to making sure that this all happens. And then for those transactions, when that liability shift takes place, the merchants shouldn't see those transactions come back as chargebacks. So really, when you look at 3DS, with the shift to e-commerce, especially during COVID here, more and more transactions went online, either through mobile or e-commerce PCs or tablets. Really 3DS is in a great position to help support those transactions and help, reduce liability or reduce chargebacks for those transactions. So here's just a little history. I mean, it's been a while. We started back in 2015 working with the brands and to identify the requirements. And again, our key focus was making sure that the data elements that were necessary to support 3DS were there in our file requirements, and that the data elements would pass and the liability shift would take place. So through 2015, we ended up working, we identified the requirements. We updated our file specification for the GDSs and acquirers to support 3DS 1.0. Those who are familiar know that we're probably at 2.2 or more right now, but 1.0 really had about 20 to 25 data elements that would be shared in the authorization authentication messages, and it really was there to help the issuer identify the cardholder. So we were working off of 1.0 for quite some time. A little bit of a lag. There wasn't much interest from the agency community back in 2016 after we did the work. So we were sort of sitting in a holding pattern. GDSs were really telling us, we'd have conversations with them, and they're saying really it depends on the agency community making that request, wanting us to make that change to help support them. But in our conversations, we ended up having a GDS back in April of 2018, passed through the new format. So we knew that things were all set on ARC side. And in 2019, we had a second GDS pass the information and update. So we were making progress, but still there really wasn't a lot of push from the agency community. So we'll see, from that point, not a lot of incentive for the GDSs to continue to move forward. And then we moved into 2020, and lo and behold, we started to hear a little bit about 2.0. And the difference between 2.0 and 1.0 is probably one of the bigger factors is the data elements that we're passing. I think it bumped up to over 100 data elements that were now being looked at. And really what the goal was from 1.0 to 2.0 was an improvement not only in the ability for the issuer to recognize who the cardholder was, but also to make it less of an issue with the cardholders. So the old issue where they go ahead and pop those challenge questions. So 2.0 was out there to make it a better experience for the end user through all those additional data elements. And by doing that, we're hearing from MasterCard and Visa that, probably 3% of those transactions that will be flowing through 2.0 should be challenged. So it really makes it a better experience for the end user in order to go ahead and move with EMV 2.0 versus 2.1. So when we moved to 2.0, there was, this is sort of an example of ARC working with the brands and with the GDSs to support the new elements. So MasterCard came to us, and there was really no change for Visa, which was good from our perspective. MasterCard came to us, and they were looking to add 3 data elements in order to support 2.0. ARC looked at our files, and we had some challenges with just making room to support those additional data elements. So we worked back and forth with MasterCard on, really what is needed to support the data and to support 2.0. And through those conversations with MasterCard, we were really able to identify just one transaction or one data element that MasterCard felt that if that was passed at this point in time, that would work. And so that data element was the transaction server directory ID. And once we were able to identify that particular one, we updated our file, and we have it added. And so now the file spec's out there, and we're ready to support 2.0. Excuse me. Again, not hearing a whole lot from the agency community at this point, but just want to let you know that it's out there and ready. And so current status, as I show here, all GDSs are ready to support. We've had some test files back and forth. So, from a GDS perspective and from an ARC perspective, we're all set. So when those agencies are out there ready to go, I think we're in good shape. The challenge is in the acquirers, we have conversations with them on a regular basis as well. 2020 was a challenge for a lot of the acquirers. I mean, MasterCard and the brands and Visa and Amex and Discover all sort of had updates, and then some of those updates were backed out and delayed. So the acquirers are doing a lot of work in 2020. But now things are behind the acquirers, and so we need to have them look at how they are ready to support 3DS, EMV 3DS in 2021. Because it's out there. I know that in the last month or so, I've probably had conversations with 3 or 4 agencies, really reaching out and trying to understand what the advantages of 3DS are and how it works. And so from that perspective, it really, from an agency perspective, it really starts with you guys, you agencies out there having a conversation with, your third-party authenticator provider, picking one of those and working with your GDS to implement, because it all starts at the point of sale with the agency, with the authentication service provider, and then working with the GDS. So if you guys if agencies are out there with some questions, we're glad to be able to reach out and help you with that. But those conversations really are best started with that third-party authentication provider or the GDS. And so where we're at the next steps. I mean, airlines and agencies continue to focus on the recovery that's underway. I think if you look at some of the prior information shared, and I think you yourselves can look at your internal information, you can see that we're seeing increase in business, and it looks like the recovery is starting, which is great. And then the key here is we're ready when agencies are ready to implement from an ARC and GDS perspective. So you airlines and acquirers out there, airlines, reach out to your acquirers if you have questions. Acquirers, make sure you're ready to support it. And then we're looking forward to getting our first couple of customers out on EMV 3DS 2.0.
So we do have one question, Kevin, and I think you answered it, but maybe just some clarity would be helpful. When did all the GDSs implement 3D Secure?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, if you're looking at 1.0, we had a couple of them implement in 2018, 2019. 2.0, which was the additional MasterCard data element, we did that in 2020, and toward the end of 2020 and early 2021, we had the GDSs make those updates. So it wasn't until recently that they've been in a position to, the earlier ones were all set, but everybody now has at least updated their file for the additional specs to support EMV 3DS early this year.
So I think the challenge, well, we have some early adopters. So some of the GDSs, do it faster than others. And the other kind of key thing to keep in mind is that I don't think we have a lot of agencies that are using that functionality within the GDS. So the GDSs are offering it, but we don't have a lot of OTAs that are taking advantage of that and actually have implemented 3D Secure. Am I wrong? We have, yeah. What do you know about the OTAs that are using it?
You're correct, Jennifer. I mean, we did some testing on 1.0, but we're not seeing any OTAs really out there and engaging. And I think that's part of the challenges that the GDSs had in implementing this. So they weren't getting those requests. And we always had conversations with the GDS saying, yeah, but when we do get those requests, then let's not have another 6 or 8 months or 12 months of development work to get us there. I mean, we've had the spec out there. We're in a position to support it. So as we move further along, let's make sure that you GDSs are making those changes as well. And again, cooperation with them. We're able to get them into a position and work with them, and then make those updates. But you're correct, Jennifer. I think part of the key is, and the GDSs will come to us and say, well, I'm not getting anybody knocking on my door for this service. So it's sort of difficult for me to move forward with some of these implementations. But now we're here on the front end. GDSs are there and ready. Hopefully the acquirers are taking a look at their roadmap and identifying, when they can implement. Because I think the challenge will be is, if an agency comes and says, hey, we're ready to go, the GDS is ready to go, and all of a sudden we're passing data and, the airline's getting that chargeback. And then what happens? Well, they'll go to the agency and the agency's saying, well, I did the GDS, I did the authorization and authentication, I passed it on to the GDS. And, we go through the loop and down through the flow, and sure enough, it comes down to the acquirer not being ready. So again, I think it's always important that, all partners in the process in the chain are ready to go. So we're hoping that when the first OTA comes on, knocks on our door, and we're ready, the acquirers will be ready as well.
Yep, true. Good.
Anything else out there from the questions perspective?
I think that's it for now.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll go ahead and turn it over to you then, Jennifer.
Chargebacks. Oh, yay, everyone's favorite topic. Chargebacks disputes. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll just start with some information. So this is debit memos. So this is not just chargebacks, but the purple fuchsia color is chargebacks, and you can see in 2020 that the volume and as a percentage of overall debit memos was up. No surprise there because of COVID and the challenges around mostly refund related chargebacks. And we're seeing it even more in 2021. So while chargebacks are a smaller percentage when you look at it by item number, chargebacks, and I don't have a slide to show this, when you do it by dollar is more painful because it is the full amount of the transaction as opposed to a booking charge or a commission fee or exchange, refund. Those types of debit memos tend to be a part of the ticket as opposed to the whole ticket amount. Let's go to the next slide. So chargeback reasons you see here in 2021, it's you see the yellow has grown, which is other, which is a little bit frustrating because other is not a great reason for a chargeback. We'd like to know what the reason for the chargeback is, but in 2020 we saw an increase in those where we didn't know. I guess what we do know is that they're not fraud or unauthorized use typically, because those are pretty easily identifiable. We saw that those unauthorized or fraud chargebacks drop as a percentage in 2020, but they're rising again in 2021. Let's go on to the next slide. So here's the ratio of chargebacks to total sales. And usually, and actually it's still a good story, even in 2020, where I think as we look back at 2020 and in years in the future, we're going to say, you know what, that was a year of anomalies and probably pay not a whole lot of attention to it. But even in 2020, when you look at chargebacks as a percentage of overall sales, 10 basis points is not terrible. 4 basis points is better, but 10 basis points for an industry that at least the perception is plagued by fraud and chargebacks is not too bad. 2021, we see the ratio is down a bit. The next slide is going to show a little bit more about why that percentage. Oh, my slide didn't make it in, but I will tell you that in 2020, chargebacks as a total number were down significantly over 2019, meaning not quite half, but they were half of the 2018 numbers, which is a great story. The reason the ratio is higher is because sales volumes were so low. So it's really not a bad story when you talk about chargeback debit memos in 2020. I think the most painful part is probably what happens prior to a debit memo being issued, which is, the back and forth that's happening between agents and airlines to try to respond to those refund not received type chargebacks or service related disputes that we saw last year that we hadn't typically seen at that volume in the past. This shows that in January and February 2020, that's kind of was the norm. We saw a jump in the next several months. You can tell with the ups and downs where some of our larger airlines put in their, maybe they missed August and they put a lot into September, but it is trending back down, and chargeback volumes now are lower than they were when we started the pandemic in January and February 2020. So I think it's a good story about chargebacks. I know that the people who manage chargebacks either within agencies or within the airline on a day-to-day don't feel like it's been a good story, because it has been a very difficult year and a half around chargebacks, just responding to the sheer volume that there was and dealing with chargebacks that we hadn't seen at that volume ever before. I was around September 11th, 2001 and experienced that. This that made that look like it was not that big of a deal. That was a blip, where this was a year of just huge disputes and chargebacks and refunds. Let's go to the next slide. So the current state, hopefully the worst is behind us. I believe that the worst is behind us, although I think the biggest concern that agencies have right now is that there are some airlines out there that have not had the staff or haven't had the time to manage their chargebacks, and agents are concerned that over the next several months, up to a year or longer, could start to see those debit memos coming through. And those are chargebacks that are old. It's very hard to work with the customers when those happen. It's very difficult. There's no opportunity to respond to the card company because the timeframes have passed, and so that there's going to potentially be some back and forth between agents and airlines that is challenging. What else? Things that are happening, we expect to see that shift from those service-related or refund-related disputes back to our typical fraud disputes. So the fraud disputes are, where chargebacks typically are. And so I think we'll see that shift back. Obviously. The chargeback working group will continue. There were times last year that we were meeting on a weekly basis, and we had, up to 70 people on a call every week to talk about what was happening between agents and airlines in chargebacks. And great, actually phenomenal collaboration between the two groups. It's a very difficult conversation to have as an airline and agency working back and forth to manage these difficult situations. But we had some amazing collaboration last year. We're down to meeting every other month now. So we went from weekly to biweekly to monthly, and now we're down to every other month, which is fantastic. But we will continue to do that as long as there's a conversation that's of value. Next is, I think we will continue to look for opportunities to reduce chargebacks. Kevin talked about 3D Secure. 3D Secure as an OTA is a great way to reduce your fraud exposure. We have some OTAs, big OTAs, that are really good at managing their fraud. But 3D Secure is another tool in that toolbox. And the great thing about it is that when authentication is attempted, there's a liability shift from the merchant to the issuer. So that means as long as everyone's doing what they're supposed to be, to Kevin's point, that acquirers are doing their piece to pass the data through to Visa or MasterCard, that liability shift will apply. The airline should never get that chargeback for that OTA initiated transaction. And also looking for opportunities to improve the chargeback management process. The back and forth that's required in our industry is very challenging. And we will always be looking for opportunities to try to improve that process. So that's kind of where we're looking for in 2021 and beyond on chargebacks. Let's see if we have any questions. I don't think we do. I don't see any questions. That's great. So we'll move on to key themes of the ARC payments form. Typically, I'm telling you, every other WebEx we've had this week, we had questions about chargebacks, and now that I'm sitting here open to talking about it and sort of addressing any questions or concerns, we don't have any. I'm not going to take credit for me being so thorough, but so let's key themes. Kevin and I have been talking about this sort of back and forth over the last couple of days since the payments forum wrapped up last week. One key theme is around authorizations. And so MasterCard and Discover both talked about initiatives they have that they're working on to improve authorization process, either to reduce declines, false declines, which is horrible because now you're turning away or declining a card for a good customer. Talk about a great way to lose a customer forever. That's one sort of initiative. The other is to provide better data on a decline. So I think what happens typically, and I think each GDS is slightly different, is that for an agency, the response is decline, and you don't really have a lot more information about that. So I think Kevin talked about how we meet regularly with the GDSs. This is something we will be talking to them about, and whether or not there's an opportunity to provide better data to agencies around reasons for declines or whatever authorization type response is required. Fraud trend. The good news is the fraud rate was pretty steady. In couple of the presentations, they showed the fraud rate up year over year. It's very similar to what I just showed on the chargeback side. When you have sales down, the rate's going to be higher. So the fact that it wasn't completely out of whack made me feel pretty good that fraud was not a huge problem. I know at ARC, traditional credit card fraud was down in 2020. Which is a good thing. We obviously expect it to come back in 2021. And I think everyone's sort of wondering what it's going to look like. How is it going to be different than it's been in the past? And I think what we heard from MasterCard in particular is it's more about phishing customers to get their information that can then be used to purchase purchase an airline ticket or delivery of something. The other thing is hacking has been a big thing. I think we know that the bad guys when they're really good, they are able to make a lot of money through hacking. So we may see that that's where the focus is in the next few years, where they're getting data from doing ransomware attacks. I know in Washington, D.C., there was a ransomware attack on the police department here. We know about the pipeline. I think that maybe they'll focus on that and kind of stay out of the air travel industry. But we have already seen, for the agents that are on the call, we have seen something that we saw several years ago reemerge, which is the phishing attack, where they collect credentials from GDS logins. And so they're phishing for the credentials. When they get them, they will book tickets. And so keep your eyes on that. We're very concerned about that. I will just, because we're talking about fraud, do a short plug for the fraud month, which is going to be September, where there's going to be sessions at least I think once a week in September about fraud and fraud prevention. So keep your eyes open for an invite from ARC for that. Another key theme, and Kevin talked a lot about data quality, is data quality remains important. And whether it's reducing expense, card acceptance expense, or reducing chargebacks, data quality is important. When the issuer can't figure out what the authorization was done and it's tied to this transaction, that is a problem and could result in a chargeback. And when that happens, it is a pain. And so we've got to make sure that the data quality, or the data flowing from the agency through the GDS to ARC and output to the acquirer to the card brand, is really tight, so that we don't have those types of issues. We're getting more and more reports from acquirers about concerns around fees, non-compliance fees. American Express doesn't have the same interchange structure that Visa and MasterCard do. They tend to handle things as a compliance issue and do assess compliance fees. Discover talked a lot about data quality, and they have a big initiative similar to what Visa and MasterCard have done in the past to try to improve the data quality on their side. And if we can't pull that together, we're at risk of merchants paying higher interchange. So that's going to be a big focus for us in 2021 and beyond. And chargebacks are always a hot topic. Like I said, for every session, except for maybe with the panel, because we didn't really talk about chargebacks during the panel session on Thursday, but all the other sessions, chargebacks were a really hot topic. For those who are wondering, Visa had to cancel sort of at the last minute this year. So we weren't able to include them in our week-long event, but my hope is that we'll be able to get them on our list for another webinar in the next couple of months to have a similar conversation that we did with MasterCard and Discover and Amex. Kevin, can you think of any other key things I've missed, forgot?
A little bit on the fraud. I mean, I think to your point, Jennifer, we'll start to see things sort of go back to normal, and you touched on it a little bit, but the social engineering aspect will continue to be heavy out there. So as agencies, just you need to be aware of that. It's coming back. You would hope fraud took a little break during 2020, but not so much so. But I know that as business picks up, to your point, we're going to be seeing new fraud schemes out there, and just always be vigilant.
Yep. Let's go on. I don't see any questions, so let's go on to the next slide. So it looks forward, and these are just our thoughts on what to expect in the next, I don't know, year, next 6 months, next year. Payments in the U.S. tend to move kind of slow. Let me just start with that. And it's partly because, and this came up on the panel the other day, because we are so credit card focused. We as consumers are tied to our credit cards. The airlines like you to use their card issued credit cards. Credit cards are really huge in the airline industry. I think that is changing, and I think there's a few things driving that. And it's changing probably slowly, but I think it's picking up pace at this point, because we have been talking about Apple Pay for, I don't know, I'm going to say at least 8 years. I didn't include cryptocurrency on here because we have literally been talking about Bitcoin for 10 years. 10 years we've been talking about Bitcoin, and it's just never taken off. I think that we are going to see some change. Probably not with Bitcoin. I just don't see airlines getting real excited about Bitcoin. Partly because of the volatility associated with it. What's the opportunity to pick up new customers? What are the other challenges there? We could see, though, stable coins come into the market and gain traction. Visa partnered with Anchorage Bank, who is the first digital bank, FDIC approved, who is supporting the USDC, which is a stable coin. So I think that's going to happen. I didn't even include that on here, but it's something we've really got our eyes on. We have our eyes, and I know all the airline payment folks out there are going, yeah, we've got our eyes on Bitcoin. We're always watching it, seeing what's going on there, and whether or not it becomes a worthwhile, viable payment option. Anyway, but what happened in 2020 was a push towards mobile. And I think people who have never used mobile to buy anything before used mobile because they didn't want to pull their card out. They've got their phone right there. They don't have to touch a terminal. They just get your phone out and pay with it. Or we saw people just have stuff delivered for the first time ever, just on a mobile device or on their computer. So I think mobile payments is growing. Again, we've been talking about Apple Pay for a long, long time. Our challenge, and this is also true for buy now, pay later, in the travel agency distribution channel where the airline is the merchant of record, we haven't been able to crack the nut on how to make that work. So typically on a mobile payment, there between your device and the merchant is a cryptogram that ties those two things together. And so when you have a third party rather than the merchant involved in that, it doesn't work. So we have got a couple GDSs that are very interested in trying to crack that nut. And so I think in 2021, that's going to be a focus for us to see what we can do to actually make that work in the travel agency distribution channel. Buy now, pay later is big. It's growing. There's more and more companies that are getting in on the buy now, pay later. We had Sezzle, who's a buy now, pay later provider, on the panel on Thursday. Very interesting. The millennials really like it, and I think what they've shown is that even people who are typically hadn't done buy now, pay later are doing it now, and they're spending more money. Travel is a great opportunity because here's your chance to go first class, pay another $100 a month or whatever, and just go and do what you want to do. I think we're going to see the roaring 20s of 2020, where people are doing things they wouldn't typically have done. I personally am not going to say, oh, I'm too old for that. I don't think ever again. I think people are going to live their lives, and buy now, pay it later lets them afford it. So that's where I think that's going to go. Improving customer experience. We've been talking about this for years too. This isn't really a new thing, but tied to the authorization discussion, it's improving the customer experience is big. It also ties to NDC, which I didn't include on here either. NDC and the opportunity for airlines to get closer to the customer is all part of that. Card brand changes, and there's a greater need for alignment around data quality. So we talked about card brand edits and potential expense there. 3D Secure, and actually making 3D Secure work is important. Card on file. We talked about this a lot last year, and card on file is something, it's kind of the thing that in the back of my head keeps me awake at night a little bit, because I think there's a risk that we're going to see some challenges with it. Card on file is where you do a one-time request on the CVV code or the CID code on the card, and so you don't have to ask the customer every time for that code. It's a better customer experience, but there's some changes that are required at the point of sale to make it actually work. And we haven't done that in our industry. So I kind of have that on my radar. We're running out of time. Chargebacks and disputes. We talked quite a bit about that. Migration of fraud to the US. We talked about 3D Secure quite a bit. We did not mention at all PSD2, which is happening in Europe, which is a requirement that transactions have multi-factor authentication. And so we could see, as Europe adopts that and actually gets on board with it, which you could debate whether or not that's happening in the travel industry right now. As that grows and happens, I think we're going to see a shift abroad to the US because we're just behind the rest of the world when it comes to 3D secure authentication or any 2-factor or 3-factor authentication requirements. That I think that's kind of it. Any thoughts, Kevin, for you? We have we are out of time.
Yeah, time, right? Yes.
So any people have questions afterwards, Kevin and I are happy to address them or attempt to address them. Reach out to us anytime. I don't see any questions. Judy, am I missing something?
No, Jennifer and Kevin, there's no questions except the one, Jennifer, that you had raised earlier, but no, great job, guys.
Okay, great. We are out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us. We are really looking forward to doing this face-to-face next year. Keep your eyes and ears open for a save the date because I think we might actually be able to publish something pretty soon. We are doing this face-to-face, so we look forward to it.
That's it. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.